I'd like to talk about something that I find very valuable and interesting as well, right? So I hope a few people come along for this walk with me, right? And what I want to talk about are the ideas of Carl Jung. He was a psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, thinker, right? Whatever way you want to label him. But he was those things and so much more, right? He was a theologian. He was essentially interested, lifelong, seriously interested in the mind, right? What is man? What is man? What is his relationship to the creation of everything, right? What is his creation to the very source of his own existence? How does he contemplate God, existence, universe, time, all these things, right? Fascinating stuff. What is mythology, right? Where do these characters come from? Why do they tend to fall in certain patterns, right? There's certain strands of story that seem to be so deeply ingrained in us that we can't help but not tell them, right? So what does this say about us? All these types of things, right? And these are really complex and complex to up until the point where you kind of start to develop your own relationship with the things he's saying, right? You can start to dance them around and allow them to enact in your imagination, right? The sorts of characters and essences, if you want to call them that he's talking about, right? But his suggestion is that these things are all aspects of us, right? So the stories, mythology, religion, psychological tendencies, instincts, all these things, they're all part of man, right? And if they're all part of man, they're so all part of ourselves. So what happens when we are lacking certain knowledge about different parts of ourselves? What happens? What kind of complexes, right, can arise? And he had a kind of topography or a map of the psyche, if you will, right? So he kind of broke it down into segments, but also wrapped it up, right? So he didn't just reduce it to one part. He pointed out different parts of man's mind, right? The map in man's mind. And then kind of tied it all up in a nice bow, right? And maybe we won't talk about that for now. But there are certain parts of his map that I wish to talk about. And to do so, and I wish to do so, to kind of tie it into what I see happening in Ireland and with the Irish mind, right? And across the West as well, but we'll focus in on the Irish mind, the Irish psyche, the Irish racial spirit, if you want, the Irish imagination. Whatever way you want to categorize it, feel free to do so, so long as you can kind of follow and apply your definition of it to what I'm talking about and try and share the meaning of where I'm going with this, right? Or you can take it or leave it and just say that's all psychobabble, blah, blah, nonsense, and Jung trying to smuggle in religion into psychology, and he ended up destroying the whole thing and rendered it meaningless, right? Rendered it devoid of any objectivity. Off you go, whatever way you want to categorize the conversation or however you want to relate to it. And Jung's map of the psyche, right? So he broke it down into different parts, and all of these parts, naturally with his inclinations towards his research and his writings and his thinking, he's seen these parts of man as alive, right? And almost it's maybe a bit of self-conscious desire and striving in each of these different parts, okay? They have a life of their own, is what I'm trying to say. And at the foreground is the persona, okay? And the persona is, we're all familiar with this, right? The persona is the uniform, or persona means mask, right? The persona is the mask or the facade we adopt to enable us to partake in society, right? The part of us that we choose to show other people, okay? I'm sure you're all familiar with that when you're in public or you're in work, you present a different part of yourself, a different face, so to speak, to the situation and the people involved in that situation, right? And the part of you that you show is different depending on who you're interacting with. So when you're speaking with your boss, it's different than when you're speaking with your partner, maybe, or your partner's family, or your neighbor, and whatever the case is, right? We're all familiar with it. We should all be familiar with that, right? And behind that then is, if you will, behind, right, whatever, but also along with that is the ego, right? The part of ourselves that we identify with. And it's nearly a kind of froze that. Yeah, it's nearly a momentary thing. The I, right? So I am aware of myself sitting in the car as usual, right? I'm aware of the temperature of the car. I'm aware of the sounds around me. I'm aware of myself looking at myself whilst recording this, right? And whatever feelings come along with that, right? A little bit of self-consciousness and doubt and all that kind of thing. The things that I'm aware of around me and in me as they relate to the things going on around me, and as they relate to myself as I'm talking about myself. I'm thinking about myself, right? So that's the ego, the I. And the word ego has a kind of poor connotation now, because if someone's a little bit full of themselves, we say, oh, he's some ego on him, right? And all that means is that the ego tends to deny parts of ourselves that we're not fully comfortable with in the moment, right? And we try and hide that and deny that to ourselves. So the ego identifies with mainly like the more favorable aspects of ourselves, because we all want to be seen to be great people, right? And when you over-identify with that, when you see yourself solely as the most preferential version of yourself possible, that is to be caught with your ego, right? So he has some ego. That makes sense of it that way. Along with those two, then we have what is called, or what Jung characterized as the shadow, which is the part of us, or the parts of us, that we deny exist, right? We're not fully conversant with or comfortable with. So we tend to deny them any sort of conscious awareness in the moment, right? If you're a little short-tempered, or if you're snappy, or if you're a little bit petulant in ways, no one wants to be like that, and no one wants to be seen to be like that. So we kind of deny that out of our existence, or out of our experience. But it is there nonetheless, right? This also, it's not just for negative tendencies in our personality. It's also for positive ones, strengths, right? Parts of ourselves that we are strong in, but we're not fully aware of it, right? And this stuff tends to be fed back to us by friends and family, right? And they might give us, they might compliment us on certain things, but because we're not fully comfortable with owning those parts of ourselves, we can deny them to ourselves as well, you know? And we tend to kind of neutralize or minimize any of our strengths by saying, sure, most people would do the same, this kind of a thing, right? By dissociating a bit from it and making it an objective tendency of people, when that's not always the case, right? Instead of saying, yes, that is something in myself that is slightly virtuous, or is completely virtuous, right? We become a little bit uncomfortable with that. And the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we deny, the parts that we find reprehensible, or the strengths that we are not willing to identify with and own based on for whatever reasons, right? That's nearly in total antagonism to the social persona. You could even say that the tendency in us to adopt the social persona, to be seen as nice to other people and good, depending on what the good is, even if it's not totally in accordance with the way we want to be, right? We'll deny the way we really want to be for the sake of social approval, right? And the sake of looking a certain way, or being seen in a positive light by other people. Those two things, yeah, that tendency nearly creates the shadow, right? Or the stronger one is adopted, the greater the other becomes, right? So the more refined we wish to be seen, and the more of a good citizen we wish to be seen, the greater our shadow is going to be, because we will deny all those aspects of ourselves that are in conflict or in tension with the, and it changes age by age, with the socially approved person, right? Or the way you should be in a society. And Jung has, as I said a few minutes ago, because he's seen these parts as being alive, right? And adding to the totality of yourself as me. I have those parts of me, but I'm not reduced just to one of those parts. I am the collection of all of those things and something more, right? And that something more he called the self. Or God, if you objectify it, right? Or make it a transcendent principle. You don't have to, but if you want to, right? As I said, take it or leave it. But because Jung spoke of these things as tending to have nearly a personality of their own, cravings of their own, with the persona, the craving or the desire to be socially approved, with the shadow, the desire to be heard, right? These things we deny about ourselves still seek expression in some way, and they can leak out of people in ways that can be odd, peculiar. Right? Why is he acting like that? He's not himself lately. Not himself according to who? According to your perception of his persona that he shows you, right? And people don't really like it when these leakages occur, right? Or when you're acting out of the norm, so to speak. But Jung spoke of the aliveness and the dynamism of the psyche, right? The undeniability of the instincts, or the desire to be free and the desire to express one's own nature, one's self, to be oneself, to thine own self be true, right? And in order, Jung recognized, or he claimed that in order for human spirit not to be killed totally, right, or not to be frozen out of the point of being creative and being alive, there's an interplay between these parts, right? A conflict, if you will, a yin and a yang kind of relationship. It is a symbiotic relationship. And he suggested that, he introduced the concept of Enantiodromia. I don't know if it's a beautiful word, but I enjoy the word. It's one of my favorite words. And what that means is the tendency of something, once taken to its extreme, to flip into its opposite. Right? And an example of that would be someone in an abusive relationship who's been bullied and just ruined, right? And beaten and rendered helplessness and just destroyed as a human being, okay? And if you can imagine someone who's been beaten and beaten and beaten and had their self-esteem destroyed, their trust obliterated, and their faith in people wholly corroded. No one wants to be beaten and abused, right? So when we are experiencing that, in order to seek love, right, or safety from the person who's doing it, right? Because you can only really be abused as well, or allow yourself to remain in an abusive relationship, if there's something you're seeking from the other person. Otherwise, you would walk away. And it would be easier to walk away if you know there's no want there. I want that person to change and be better to me, that sort of a thing, right? So as we experience abuse, the desire to fight back, to stand up for ourselves, becomes repressed, right? It becomes denied to ourselves. But Jung says that these strivings and desires, they don't just go away. They just become ignored. And the more and more that we deny these things, the more power they start to accumulate, until the point where they leak out or lash out, right? They become so overwhelming that they dominate the person in that moment, and they give full expression to maybe years of denial, right, and years of being ignored. And you see this many times with people who've been abused for whatever period of time. They snap, right? And what do we mean by snap? It means there's a break in how they tended to conduct themselves, and something else kicks in. Something seems to take over them for whatever period of time, momentarily. And we see this in like domestic abuse relationships, where the person snaps and takes out the perpetrator. The very opposite of what they had been presenting to the person that part of themselves that allowed themselves be abused for so long, or experienced the abuse for so long, snaps and gives way to all of those forces that were denied expression. The desire to stand up for yourself and to eradicate the evil that you're being subjected to. Enantiodromia, right? One thing flipping into its opposite, or the very presence and existence of one aspect of one's mind also summoning the very opposite of it. And that the summoning of the very opposite of it leads to a direct conflict, which means that this is why ages change and move, right? People's moods and tendencies and their morality changes and shifts in nearly unpredictable ways, right? And I believe that this is what we're witnessing with the Irish people, right? So our desire and our tendency to adopt the social persona and to put so much of our weight and value and morality into how you're perceived by other people has created a massive, massive backlog of unexpressed desires and instincts in the Irish people. And I believe we're beautifully sitting in a time where that shadow, the snapping, is taking place. It's become so painful to align and to identify with the social persona that there's a break in the dam. And those undenied and unexpressed, those denied and unexpressed forces, if you will, are now beginning to flood forward. And not only that, they're beginning to manifest in the world, right? They're beginning to find expression. And what we're witnessing is that expression seeming to crystallize in the character of Conor McGregor, okay? And what I also want to bring in is that Conor McGregor, speaking on what he's speaking about and the potential for him getting into one of the highest offices in the land, that's a non-starter if Irish people had not for years and years kept the flame of freedom in the, maybe just personally, silently in their hearts, kept that flickering, right? And stood up against all sorts of social condemnation and disapproval and losing friends and having family members not speak to them anymore, maybe losing jobs, becoming nearly unemployable based solely on the views they have. That is a fight. It has been a fight, and it continues to be a fight. And it was fought by people in silence for many, many years. You get outbursts of groups of people pooling together, and maybe it dissipates for a while, right? But that desire just to be Irish, without defining it for somebody else, for their social approval. Tell me what you mean by being Irish. No. I don't have to tell you anything. I do not have to explain my nature to you so you can condemn it and ridicule it and feed it back to me as to whether you find it tolerable or not. None of us have to do that. But yet we've been doing that for decades. Some more than others, but we've all done it in ways, right? And as I'm saying, that backlog builds and builds and builds until the psyche is imbalanced. And in order to rectify that imbalance, there's a direct conflict between opposites occurs. And we're in the process of witnessing that now. And that has become each individual's personal relationship with their denied nature and tendencies and desires has become linked to each other's personal relationship with that process. And that has spilled over into nearly a cascading tsunami of a collective breaking of the psychic dam. No longer will we be denied, you could say, it is what you're looking at. We are Irish, full stop. That's what's manifesting. And again, I'm looking at this nearly separate from the personal side of it. Right? The personal side of people at play is nearly no longer relevant, right? There's a process occurring that is undeniable because it is beyond the filtering of social approval. It is the very, you can call it for the moment, it is the very antithesis or enemy, if you will, of bowing to social approval. Doesn't mean that social approval or engaging in an approved way with society is meaningless or is evil in some way, but it can become so frozen that it is detrimental to life. And what's interesting about this process is that it's ongoing. It is undeniable, as I said. It goes on whether you want it to or not. And Jung highlighted this when he said that psychotherapy, you need not have a therapist to engage in that, but what you need to have is strength of moral strength in order to reflect on yourself and recognize the parts of yourself that you have abused, that you have denied free expression to. That there's a moral strength needed to engage in that act, and not everybody has that constitution. It's not something that you're going to be born with to a degree, right? It's something you have to build and work on. Become brutally honest with yourself. And not by just condemning yourself and writing yourself off, but to be brutally honest with the things that you have that make you strong. The things that you have that make you a little bit different than other people. The things that you have that can help. The weapons that you have in your nature that allow you to combat evil in a specific way that is peculiar to you. And so, with what is going on, we are confronted with the collective crystallization of the Irish shadow, which seems to have taken the form of Conor McGregor, or is represented or symbolized in the person of Conor McGregor. Okay? Like Aragorn plays the hero in Lord of the Rings, Jon Snow plays the hero in Game of Thrones, right? The Punisher is like an anti-hero, right? Different shades of a character that is detrimental to the static, the frozenness of the status quo. It's going to rock the boat in some way. Leave morality aside for the minute. It's just going to rock the way things are. And what happens as a result of that? The trickster sort of archetype, the thing that just throws a spoke throws a stick in the spoke of the wheels, right, and shakes things up, so things don't become too calcified and dead, right? And that's what we're engaged with at the moment. And each individual person has the freedom, right, the freedom to deny or the freedom to relate to this process, right, and to their morality. When the very things that Irish people have denied about themselves out of fear of being ridiculed socially manifest themselves publicly and on a national scale. What sort of relationship do we form with that? What sort of relationship, what stance do we take to this? The confronting of all aspects of ourselves we've spent so long denying. What happens to an individual? What choices do you make in terms of how you relate to that? Do you get defensive about it and wish to ridicule it? Or do you accept that there's parts of that that are being symbolized in one person, or many people, but mainly, as I'm saying, in the figure of McGregor, right? Things that we don't like about ourselves. We deny that he's Irish. He's not one of us. Why? Because of some actions he might have taken before. And our morality, our moral position in reference to the actions he might have taken, how we perceive him morally reflects our own morality, right? And our own relationship with ourselves, and with how we wish to be seen as individual Irish people, and how we wish the Irish people as a total to be seen. This is a day of reckoning for many people, for all of us, because we are being confronted with something that is irrepressible. And what our future looks like, will be determined by the relationship we develop with that. Do we deny a hero again, someone who is taking a heroic stance, archetypally, right? In terms of mythologically, if you want. There's someone who's wishing to stand up against the whole system of what he believes to be corruption, whatever it is, evil, right? That's a heroic thing to do, objectively, regardless of how we subjectively feel about the person who's taking that heroic stance. The fact of the matter is, there's a heroic stance being taken. And I would suggest to people that it is far more instructive that people engage with that instead of the person who's taking the stance. What is our relationship like with the heroic? When we see someone stand up against most people and say, I don't believe you to be correct, I believe my position to be the superior position, what do we do with that? How do we react to someone who's willing to stick their neck out so much like that? And rattle the cage and muddy the waters? What do we do? What's our reaction to that? That's what's going to be telling for each and every one of us. And that is why this is such an interesting turn of events in Ireland. Because there's something here for each and every one of us to learn. And we can grow from this and get to know ourselves in a deeper, a more profound way. Or we can continue to deny parts of ourselves that seek expression. And by doing that, that manifests in our behavior as ridicule and condemnation of other people. Which path will you take?